Good afternoon and welcome to Registry Trust's first LinkedIn Live event. I'm Chris Dick, Chief Executive, and I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel who I'll be introducing in just a moment. Today we're going to be unpacking our latest report From Foundation to Future and the discussions that took place at our 40th anniversary annual review last year, where various stakeholders joined us to discuss the importance of the public register. But today's not just about data, it's about fairness, transparency, trust, and how the register needs to evolve to continue to be an important instrument for consumers, the industry and policymakers. And please do get involved. It's your chance to let us know what you think. So please do add your questions and comments as we go through the conversation today. If we don't get the chance to answer them, we will come back to you post-event. Okay, now it's time to introduce our panel. So if I could ask you to introduce yourselves, let us know your relationship to Registry Trust, and a little bit about what struck you at the annual review that you're excited to talk about today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So my name is Mick McAteer. I'm the chair of Registry Trust. I also wear a few other hats. I'm co-director of the Financial Inclusion Centre. And I've got to say, it is a real privilege to be chair of such a wonderful organisation, such a great team, because it also gives you a chance to work with great stakeholders at the Ministry of Justice and the Court Service, and everyone from civil society and the industry that was there at the annual review to celebrate 40 years of Registry Trust. And I think that's the big message I took away from the annual review, that this is very much a collaborative process, and getting a chance to work with various stakeholders, I think, is a great opportunity for Registry Trust.
Thanks, Mick.
Hi Chris, I'm Faith Reynolds and I'm a consumer advocate working across a range of areas in financial services, and I was delighted to be asked to facilitate at the annual event, and I just really enjoyed it. As you said, Mick, there were lots of different people there offering different perspectives, and it was a really thought-provoking session. So when you asked me to get involved in writing the report, I was like, thumbs up, I'm going to be there. So yeah, so that's how I come to be here today.
Thanks, Faith.
And I'm Eric. I'm a long-standing director at Registry Trust Limited. My day job is representing the banking industry in negotiations on policy and regulatory issues with government and regulators. And there's a very strong correlation. We saw at the 40th anniversary the number of regulators and government officials that are as interested in the register as lenders. And that plays to the point that Mick made. Is absolutely, I think, about cooperation across the sector.
Thanks, Eric, and great to have you all with us. Thank you for giving us your time this afternoon. If we perhaps start by thinking about the register and itself, and it's been around for a long time, in some form since the 19th century, and as we've touched on already, Registry Trust has been stewarding that register for the past 40 years. But we know that the world, the economy, consumer and business requirements have changed massively over the years. I think what we all felt was terrific was to see the resounding sense of the register is still important, a really critical financial instrument, and that was great to hear last year. From your perspective, Mick, why do you think that continues to be such a critical part?
Yeah, I think that really is the critical question, Chris, here, because I think if the register didn't exist, I think we'd still have to invent it. When I think back to if you look at the history of the organisation, when you look back to the reason why Malcolm Hurston set the register up, really the essence of the register is to promote trust and confidence in economic transactions. Now, what does that mean? It means that lenders can lend with more confidence, but on the consumer side, it means that ordinary people can try and reclaim money they owed if a business has treated them unfairly. So it has become an essential part, really, of promoting trust and confidence in the business world and in general in economic activity. But on top of that, if you think about the amount of data Registry Trust holds, it has become an invaluable tool, and I think it could be more valuable tool for providing research and data on problem debt, financial vulnerability at a very granular local level. It is one of the most timely and granular data sets around financial vulnerability and problem debt. So again, we're very, very keen to sort of big up the public data nature of our work. It's a very important commercial tool for promoting trust in business, but it's also a very important public data tool. So yeah, I mean, when you think about the role it has in business, but also in the wider policy agenda, I got to say, you would invent it if it didn't exist. Yes. And having a single trusted non-profit intermediary as that single source of data, rather than having numerous providers, I think makes that data and the provision of that data all the more important.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. It was really good to hear that from our stakeholders as well, wasn't it, last year? Yeah. Faith, Eric, anything you want to add to that point?
I think there's a lot of exciting opportunity. So when we think of the register historically, it really captured events that had happened. What's so exciting, the point that Mick makes, is that the more we're able, perhaps using large language models, more in-depth analytics, the more we're able to interrogate the data, the better we'll be able to look forward as much as we look back. Yeah. So that doesn't just mean that, to Mick's point, that consumers, lenders can understand previous behaviour, can also start to think about what the propensity might be for future behaviours, and that I think is critical for a successful economy.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thank you. And I think we would all agree that we're keen as an organisation not to stand still and to look to the future and think about innovation and how things might change. And certainly, I think one of the strongest messages that came through last year's review was that the register itself does need to evolve and change and develop to continue to be that vital instrument. If you think about your takeaways, and perhaps Eric, I'll come to you first of all, and we think about CCJs and the data as it exists today, what are the limitations with that process as it stands, or the data set as it stands, that you'd like to see developed?
So first we should say CCJ data is invaluable, so it must and should always have a place in considering whether an individual, a business, a lender wants to engage with a third party. However, it is quite a long established model, and perhaps as we consider the way that we can do things in the 21st century, we maybe need to adapt. One key issue that I'm always quite concerned about is the persistency of a county court judgment and the long shadow implications that might have for consumers. That might be right, that might be wrong, but I'm not sure we're asking that question thoroughly enough just now.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Faith, as you say, you've been involved on the day and in pulling the report together. What were your key takeaways?
Yeah, I think Eric's absolutely right. There's this sort of some limitations in the data, particularly around how the data gets used for all sorts of purposes. It gets used by lenders, it gets used by people looking to check potential tenants, it gets used by companies to check people who are applying for jobs. So the impact of the data can be quite significant, and it's really important that then that data is accurate and timely. And some of the sort of limitations mean that it's not always clear, where the CCJ has come from. So who's the original claimant? And CCJ could have come from a lender, it could have come from a utility provider, but it could have come from a parking fine. So when you are sort of surprised you didn't get a job, it might be because you had a parking fine, and some might suggest that that actually isn't sort of like proportionate. And so there is this question about how do we provide more detail around claimant data so that it's much easier to interpret the data that comes out correctly by different organisations. And so that's one of the kind of key areas where I think there's some significant work that could be done to really sort of enrich the data, provide a bit more information about those organisations that are actually seeking repayment.
Great, thanks, Faith. And Mick, from your perspective?
Yeah. Look, I mean, just to echo what Eric and Faith have been saying there, as I say, it's so important that we have a trusted intermediary organisation that oversees data integrity around judgments. But if we do have a sort of an area where it needs improvement, the data can be quite binary. You either have a judgment or you don't, and that's the only thing that's reflected on the register. Now, we're certainly very, very keen to try and work with stakeholders and government and industry and so on to see if we can enrich the data on the register. We'll come on to the issue about satisfactions later on and so on, but there are issues around partial settlements, the categories of the debt, as Faith was referring to. Surely a judgment arising from a parking fine should be treated differently to a recurring debt payment, for example. So I do think there are quite a number of fairly minor changes that could have a big impact that I think could lead to a much more enriched register that I think that better reflected people's circumstances to try and move away from this sort of more binary position that we have at the moment.
Yeah. And we talked, don't we, about enabling better, more informed decisions, and so better data supports that. And as you say, we can touch on satisfactions in a moment and the process for satisfying a CCJ. I think in terms of really interesting to hear your thoughts around claimant information, and obviously post the government's consultation and the MOJ's decision to legislate for the addition of claimant name. That's something we're really excited about at Registry Trust. We're hoping that we will see progress on that this year, and whilst that won't be something that we can backdate across the register, it will, at least in terms of forward-looking, to your point, Eric, will help us to make better decisions with the data moving forward. So a really exciting change coming along. If we perhaps think about the satisfactions process for judgments, and I guess for people's awareness on the call that may not be aware, a judgment, as Eric said, stays on the register for a number of years, 6 years for a judgment on the register. A satisfied judgment will be marked as paid and as satisfied, but still remains on the register for 6 years. So still consequences, but clearly an indicator that somebody has made an attempt to repay their debt. Now, something else that people may not be aware of is that the burden of satisfaction doesn't currently sit with the claimant, that sits with the defendant to apply for that status, which I think from our perspective is something we'd like to see changed. Mick, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm sure Eric and Faith can add much more than me on this one, but the key point I would make is, look, you know, we know there's a very strong relationship between people facing problem debt and having a mental health issue, you know, and anxiety around money. Whereas, you know, it does seem unfair, really, that at a very stressful moment in someone's life, that they should be required to remember to notify the courts with proof of payment that they have satisfied an outstanding debt. You know, that doesn't seem fair in this world where we're much more aware of mental health issues as a governing factor in people's decision making. So it kind of makes sense. It kind of seems fairer that it should be a requirement for the claimant to notify the courts that an outstanding claim has been settled. Not only does it seem fair, to us it seems like a more efficient way to make sure that the register of judgments is actually more reflective, you know, as we talked about in the previous question, that it actually reflects the current reality of the judgment. You know, so yeah, we're big supporters, and we know others are supporters as well of getting satisfactions, the burden of proof reversed really onto the claimant.
Yeah, and
by the way, I could say I don't think this is a particularly onerous requirement on the claimant. You know, I mean, it could be done via an email or some kind of other technological matter that Faith can talk better. I'm a technophobe, by the way. So, but anyway, I don't think it's a particularly onerous requirement on claimants. It's a small change that could have a big impact, a big difference. You know.
Yeah, great point.
Just to that point about small change, big impact. When you kind of, so in the report we've got some examples of. From the research around lived experience of dealing with this, and it's a very bureaucratic process. It's not simply a case of paying and then notifying. It's paying, notifying, getting form, getting a certificate, and you have to provide proof that you have repaid. If you don't have proof of payment, you have to provide other sorts of proof. And what we see is that actually there then becomes a bit of a bottleneck at the courts, where people might email, but they might receive a response saying it's normal not to hear from us for 20 weeks. And so that's really a substantially bureaucratic, time-consuming process to engage with. And interestingly, I think that the other part of that is where, for instance, you perhaps, you know, you got a parking fine, didn't pick it up, didn't read the letter, somehow got put in the recycling, it happens. You may not even be aware. So we also saw in that research that people aren't aware they've got a CCJ until they're trying to get a mortgage. And then you've got this, how do I quickly rectify the problem? And if you can't if you're like, I'm ready to pay, let me rectify, let me see what I can do. If you can't rectify that quickly, then you're not really, you're living with quite substantial impacts on your life, which again aren't proportionate. So I think there is a massive consumer concern, consumer angst, consumer anxiety that goes into this, even if actually it wasn't a big deal. It's just something that you didn't notice happen at the time.
Yeah.
And I think Faith makes a very valid point. So we talked about the limitations of the data and the register, as Mick says. You know, integral to any good database is the veracity, the accuracy of the data. And if a debt has been satisfied, that gives you a very different signal. One is debt proved in a court that there is a debt. The other is a debt that has been proved has been settled. And not understanding that will have consequences, as Faith alluded to. So I think the first point is it's key for the integrity of the data itself. Then I think, coming back to what Faith was discussing, I think that a lot of consumers really do not understand what a county court judgment is for a consumer. What does it mean? What's the process? And maybe it's something that's deprioritised. Maybe it's something they'll get round to but never do. And as a process, I think consumers, as they learn about what a CCJ is, would be really surprised in the 21st century that it operates in the way that Faith describes. I think most would consider that this would be a much more digital, a far more slick journey.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think there's a couple of key themes, isn't there, that, as you say, Faith, came through that report. One, that understanding of the journey itself and people being able to interact and engage with it.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, just to remind viewers, really, I mean, how many million judgments are there? 5.4 million judgments, but we think only around, it kind of hovers between only 11 and 12% of judgments over the years tend to be satisfied. Now, we will be publishing our latest data tomorrow, the Q4 2025 statistics. That's coming out tomorrow, so look out for that.
That's a good plug.
I remember too later. But I mean, that'll just remind us of just how few judgments, what a low proportion of judgments are actually marked as satisfied. And we've just had the government's financial inclusion strategy, and we welcome so many of the measures in that, but it would be great to see a big push now on satisfaction. As you say, it's one of those small changes that could make a big difference to people's financial position. Yeah.
I think just that kind of conversation about, do people understand what a CCJ is? Again, it came out quite strongly that the language around the process, of course. Even remembering claimant versus defendant, what am I, who am I in the middle of this? All the language changes, it goes into a formal process, and so people are struggling with some of the jargon, and I think we see this across financial services anyway. There's definitely a need to just make the journey much simpler, much easier to engage with, and so any burden that you can take off the defendant, the person who's trying to get their issue sorted out, the better. So I think, language does come up as a real big issue for people. They don't quite even know even if they read the letter, it's too much jargon, didn't understand it.
Absolutely. And as we talked about earlier, CCJs can mean different things in terms of where the claims originated from, but for a number of those people in financial difficulty as well, it's also perhaps not the easiest time to be dealing with that kind of information as well. So simplicity, process improvement, with the number of companies that raise claims, how can we shift that burden in order to help? And we do see that evidence from the research that people do think once it's paid, well, that's done and dusted. And actually, sometimes they only realise when they come to make a financial transaction that actually it's still there and I've got this problem. So really good point. One of the key areas, I think, which is everybody's thinking about across organisations is around automation and technology, and I guess process improvement and making everything simpler leads quite nicely into that subject for us. So it was mentioned quite a few times in the annual review. How can technology, how can automation and potentially artificial intelligence support with improving processes, making life simpler and easier for people involved in the process? But we did also get on the day a really strong warning of, let's be careful, innovation's important, but it mustn't come at the expense of data integrity and trust. And I'm interested to know, from your perspectives, how we balance that sort of drive for opportunities against that need for data integrity, and some of the thoughts that you've taken away. Perhaps, Faith, I know you were, again, very involved in some of those discussions. Your thoughts on the technological opportunities? Yeah,
so there is real opportunity, and I think this is, when you look at what's happening through the journey, effectively information and money at some points, the information is being exchanged across a group of different participants, and that information could be bolstered and enriched, as we've heard earlier, with some new data fields, but also it could be moved between those participants more quickly and more efficiently. And I think that's really where the technology opportunity comes, is if we say that actually we think it's much easier for the lender to update the courts when somebody's somebody's paid, then actually they could do that through an API. They could do that through a trusted data sharing ecosystem. They manage to upload their claims through an API, but so why can't they upload their updates? And actually, could it be done through API calls which are a bit more real-time rather than bulk transfers, so that actually there's more real-time data flowing through the system? So there are some opportunities there just to make it a bit quicker, especially within the environment where we have more people using things like buy now, pay later, or we've got different creditors and the speed of lending is moving up. Could we also use technology to speed up? So there's just what feel like very straightforward opportunities with technology to improve the process and the system.
Yeah. Thanks, Faith. Eric, perhaps come to you next with your own views on that.
I think we need to be quite thoughtful, because we always need to consider causation and correlation, and I wonder if those efficiencies would actually impact the quality of the database in a negative way, because what we're really talking about is the process that leads to the creation of the data. And perhaps we just need to step back and we need to think about how, to your point, we can make that far more slick. We think of the stakeholders, we think of the small business, the lender, the consumer, the landlord, whoever, and how they could perhaps benefit if we had a process that was streamlined, like Trust Online, for example, where you can go onto our website and you can identify if there are any judgments. That feels much, much more intuitive than some of the quite expansive processes that we've discussed. That wouldn't affect the quality of the data. What we could then think about is the additives. So the timeliness of inputs will improve the quality of the data. The content, for example, satisfactions, will improve the quality of the data. And then I think our ultimate ambition is who are those consumers who might not be aware, who might not have been in a position to identify. And that's not just those with mental health. I think you're quite right to call that out. But we could also think of any health or accident, any incident that perhaps knocks you off track and the usual life admin perhaps gets deprioritised for valid reasons. And then there are much more difficult and sensitive areas such as domestic abuse. And I think it's really important, and we talk about how we enhance the database and the register, is when we think about public use and public good, we're really keeping that as our North Star, not sort of more operationally thinking about making the data that little bit cleaner, because I think that's going to be more incremental, where the step change will probably lie elsewhere.
I think you make a good point about vulnerable consumers and actually how they are able to identify that they're vulnerable within that ecosystem. We see this in other sectors where your utility providers or banks or whoever need to know that actually somebody is vulnerable, that they've experienced something difficult or they've got some particular needs. And I think we don't have easy processes for doing that. And so whilst it can feel sort of like expansive, actually beginning to lay some of the groundwork for sort of where consumers can consent to share data directly into systems like the Registry Trust means that actually they can say, look, I'm vulnerable, and they only have to say that once. Yeah. And they can choose to share that information rather than having to explain it to every different organisation that they have to deal with through this process. So I think there are some kind of like, some of the new things that come online can actually help people and reduce some of the friction, especially if they're trying to say, look, I need this information in a different format, or I need a bit of time, or please can you recognise that I'm particularly vulnerable and I need to be careful who this information gets shared with. So there are some really interesting ways that kind of data sharing could be used to actually really help people as well as the kind of efficiency of the system.
Yeah.
I think Eric and Faith raise a really, really important point here. There's the issue of the quality of the data that's on the register and whether we can enrich that data, to be better, more reflective of people's personal financial circumstances. But then there is the process, which I think is sort of we should think of those really maybe in two different ways. You know, as we've talked about already, we're working very hard to see if we can sort of enrich the data on the register.
Yeah.
But also look, I mean, we've also commissioned a piece of work that deconstructs the debt journey from when a person gets into debt to when a debt is enforced at the courts. Now what we're hoping that will come out of that work is opportunities, or allow us to identify opportunities where we can improve, not just us, but everyone involved in the debt journey can improve the process. You know, and we're very much, very keen to support. You know, the government is very keen to promote automation and innovation in public services and within commercial markets. So anything we can do there, I think, you know, we can certainly try to help. But I would actually include a bit of a warning around this, particularly around the use of AI. Now, in my other job, you know, doing research and policy analysis at the Financial Inclusion Centre, we are coming across a number of examples where the AI-generated data is just frankly wrong. It is just wrong, you know, when it comes to economic analysis data or socioeconomic data. And the thing that would worry me is that the great strength and one of the purposes, the original purposes of Registry Trust was to be that trusted intermediary that meant that was there to make sure that any data that went into the rest of the system was as accurate as it could possibly be. So absolutely, let's explore how we can use automation and innovation to improve the process, but we cannot lose sight of the primary importance of ensuring data integrity, because it doesn't take a lot to imagine what would happen if false information about a person's debt position, signified through a county court judgment, got into the rest of the system. That would be replicated throughout the system very, very quickly, and it would become incredibly difficult to unwind that false information that was now embedded in the system. So yeah, let's very, very keen to work on how we can enrich the data, improve the process, but we cannot just lose sight of this need for the primary goal of maintaining data integrity. We're not there with AI yet to be trusted enough to ensure data integrity.
Yeah. Something we need to think about really carefully then in terms of maintaining that access to justice and, as you say, the integrity of the data set.
I think the other thing which sort of strikes me in the move to sort of automation and digital is that you can end up with something that just doesn't feel or work as well. So if you think about all of your experiences with multiple apps for this or that, or the log-on times that you need to do, or I can only access this but I can't seem to get logged in, and now there's another form I need to do before I get to the form that I need to fill in. And for some people online, it's really difficult to fill forms in online. So when thinking about kind of automation and trust and how we improve that process, there's a need to co-design that with the people who have had experience of going through it, of actually sitting down and working with them. And I like, Mick, your point of actually, this isn't one bit of a journey. For the consumer, they've had a much longer journey, which includes sort of potential debt and kind of going through process with multiple organisations, often putting in place repayment schedules. That in itself, we know that debt advice process can be very kind of hard work, time consuming, quite paper based. So as we kind of look at the whole journey, how do those things interact so that somebody does have a really good experience overall? And that's a real consumer design point, but it also it's important to look at things in the round rather than saying, well, we're going to improve this bit, they can improve that bit, and then what happens is the consumer experiences lots of different bits that don't communicate with one another.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think just on those points, some of the comments we had back from the annual review was people who are perhaps new to our annual review were surprised at the wealth of stakeholders. So I think a real strength of Registry Trust is sitting in the middle of that ecosystem and the stakeholders that we work with, which is great. But as you've touched on, also through the review, that commitment to commissioning an end-to-end piece of research about the debt journey, so that we can just not look to make improvements in our own little part of the journey, but look at the end-to-end process and how we can make that easier. So really good points. On that point, we've had some really good questions and comments in, which just shows our stakeholders throughout the journey are interested and invested as well. And just a reminder to anybody watching too, please do drop your comments. If we don't get the chance to get them to them today, we'll certainly pick those up in the days to come. But a few things just to pick out. Some comments there agreeing with the ambition on the mandatory recording of satisfactions, but concern about the process. Again, making sure that that process is frictionless, isn't going to overwhelm an already overwhelmed court system, and just thinking about where that burden falls if a claimant's no longer represented by a solicitor. So some good points there, sure. I think worth considering. The other point around, how much are the changes dependent on the further digitisation of the courts? How could more be lifted from the courts to support faster resolution for the consumer? And I know, one of the things we've been keen to remind people is that sort of close and very positive working relationship with the Ministry of Justice and the HMCTS teams. But certainly something to look at there. We can only innovate and digitise in partnership by identifying areas that we can relieve pressure.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Chris. We are part of the journey, and we will do what we can to improve our part of the journey, but we're also there to enable and facilitate and help others improve their part of their journey as well. So the more we do collaborate really on looking at the end-to-end journey, I think the ultimate goal really is to make this better for ordinary people who get themselves into the system. That's what it's all about, really. But we're obviously we're very aware of sort of the potential unintended consequences. We wouldn't do something without working through what the consequences would be for others in that part of that journey as well. So the more we engage with everyone in that journey, then I think the better outcomes will result.
Yeah.
And I think in that we have to be, I guess the underlying point in that observation about the courts is we have to be very clear that there are two sides to every story. And the point of going to the court is to establish that there is a debt. It is proven, a judgment is made. And at no point, I think, should we be designing a process where that is subordinated or the defendant doesn't have the opportunity to put their point across. So the point's very well made. I still feel that actually within the court process and the transfer of information within that sort of journey, there is a lot of efficiency. And then just broadening slightly, we're talking more about a sort of the absolute application. But if we consider, say, digitising a home buying and selling process, a lot of people, a lot of viewers watching will have suffered that to an extent. As part of the formation of the information one might need, it would be great, wouldn't it, if one understood that there were obligations that needed to be dealt with before you started looking for the des res or the dream home. Yeah. And that's but one case where actually, without necessarily having to rely on AI that perhaps needs to mature a little further, we can actually build efficiencies into various different processes, and that just helps productivity.
Absolutely.
You make a really interesting point about effectively access to justice and through this process. And I think that was one of the things that I found very striking, is that a very high percentage, and you'll have to check the report, but I think it's around 92% of CCJs are settled without any defence. And now that might be because somebody knows that actually they don't have a defence, or it might be because they don't have an awareness or they can't afford a defence. So quite a lot of this is very administrative. We absolutely want to make sure that that point of access and being able to say, hang on a minute, I'm not sure this is right, is still there. And I just wonder if there are opportunities to really investigate that part. So why didn't you? Or why hasn't somebody actually defended that claim? Perhaps they just thought, I haven't got the money or the time or the energy, but perhaps they weren't aware of what that process was and how they could do it. And so I think there is something interesting, I think, and I think we've kind of noted it in the report, about whether there should be any onus on claimants to actually identify to the courts when was the last point of contact. Have we had any conversations about repayment schedules? Well, when were we last able to contact this person? Because sometimes debts get moved on, don't they? They get sold, and then they're not quite sure where the defendant lives, and so they're just sort of, if you like, scattering seeds and hoping. And so I just wonder if there is something there about that connection between the defendant, the claimant saying, yes, we know who the defendant is, the defendant knows who we are, and we actually have an ongoing relationship, versus something that's a little bit more, we're just putting the CCJ and we haven't seen them for months, we don't know where they live and we can't contact them.
Yeah, and different elements to that subject, but a key point of actually how do we drive engagement with the process, as you say, Faith. Some of the comments that we've received, a really good point around the importance of company number in identifying commercial entities. Again, if we think about continuous improvement, we're keen to see ways that company data can be matched more effectively and support better decisions. So a really good pick up there to remind us of that one, and that's something that we're keen to work with stakeholders on to progress. I think one of the points that we moved over quite quickly, we don't intend to go into too much detail now, but I think just important to recognise, Eric, you touched on the issue around coercive debt and economic abuse, and how these very complicated areas need to be considered, and Registry Trust's role within that as well.
And this plays to the point that Faith has made, that actually one partner might not be aware. That might have been masked from them, and how are they able to recover that situation, I think is absolutely critical, particularly if the two partners go their separate ways.
Yeah.
And there are other use cases, but absolutely it's one we should keep front of mind.
Yeah. Can I just add something to that?
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think this is such an important issue. I mean, I think research suggests, I think it's 1.4 million people last year were victims of coerced debt. Now, the majority of those are women, and in the Domestic Abuse Act, economic abuse is listed as one of the types of domestic abuse. So I mean, speaking personally here as a sort of financial inclusion campaigner, it just seems wrong that someone's life should be blighted by having a judgment that might be on the register as a result of them being a victim survivor of coerced debt. Now, this is not about forcing people to make decisions about relationships or things like that, but it's about autonomy and giving people the choice to try and remove a judgment that has arisen as a result of coerced debt. It just seems unfair that has happened as a result of coerced debt. So again, look, I mean, these are decisions outside of our scope, but all the message we'd like to send is, we are there to work with people to see if there is a workable way of actually reflecting or removing a judgment that has arisen as a result of coerced debt. It seems unfair, it just seems unreasonable. I mean, surely we can put our brains together to actually find out an administrative solution to actually addressing this. I think is a very, very iniquitous issue affecting potentially hundreds of thousands of people.
And I know, Faith, you're itching to come in.
No, that's fine. You go for it.
We just have to be very careful, right? So
yes, of course. There are consequences, of course.
I'm 100% with Mick on this. We need to ensure that victim survivors are in a safe space
of course.
And are able and willing to take forward what could potentially be a criminal prosecution. So not only, if we have to, a criminal court has to prove either coercion or fraud, someone simply forged a signature, we want to make sure that there's a process that is very sympathetic. We want victim-led support for any kind of criminal prosecution as well. We're digressing on Faith. I just interjected a little bit because
maybe it's a bit of a question for you, Chris, but if I've understood correctly, the process when you're in a case where there's two parties, so it's not just perhaps in one person's name, but actually in joint name, and that relationship's fallen apart, and perhaps there's been some real kind of harm caused there as well. When one party tries to get a satisfaction, they have to engage with the other party. They have to get information. They have to do that project together in some sense. So we're asking people who've been through quite traumatic experiences to then go back and somehow communicate with the perpetrator of harm and then to satisfy the debt. I think that's really quite disconcerting, quite worrying. Like that would just mean I would live with the CCJ, right? There are more important things in that moment to think about, like where am I going to live, or how am I going to protect my children, or whatever. So,
as I say, just to come back again on that point, I don't think anybody's saying that someone should do this. It's about giving them it's about giving them the option.
But making the process work.
Yeah, making the process work. You know, and if the conclusion is after negotiation or after getting advice or support from debt advice charities or support groups, that it is a good move to remove that judgment.
Yeah.
All we're saying is, I mean, surely there must be an administrative process that allows a victim survivor to actually at least undo the damage that has been done.
I think I'm agreeing with you, Mick. I just think that involves improving the process so that somebody doesn't have to go and contact somebody else about it. So yeah, I think it's that.
But there must be a fundamental moral point here that
absolutely.
Why should a woman be subjected to disadvantaged conditions for 6 years as a result of her partner getting her into debt and landing her with a judgment? That just seems wrong. You know, I mean, more than anything else. You know, it's like
and as I say, a very important topic, and good to touch on that as we have done, but more thinking to be done. Of course, I think. In terms of the satisfaction process, with a joint judgment, if one party can apply for satisfaction and actually another party can end up then with an outstanding satisfaction. So improving the process so it's more transparent, I think, will be critical. We've just got a little bit of time now for some very quick questions for each of you before we finish. So first one to Faith. If you could add one data field to CCJs tomorrow, what would it be?
It would be debt type.
Okay. Thanks, Faith.
Would you like me to explain?
No, go on quickly. Yes, go on. We've not got a lot of time.
Quickly, because actually, in other parts of the world where we're looking to extend credit to people who have thin credit files or who have difficulty accessing credit, CCJs that aren't related to credit and previous problems are withholding credit from those people. And actually, that's part of a productive economy, is to be able to get credit to people who need it. And so in my other world of sort of thinking about how do we actually get the UK working well and be able to help people smooth income or access productive credit, I think it's important that we know what that CCJ relates to.
Yeah.
Around half of CCJs are only for about £750. So we know that very low amounts probably related more to parking fines.
Yeah.
I hazard a guess.
Thanks, Faith. Mick, who should ultimately be responsible for reporting satisfactions?
Well, I mean, as part of our campaigns, it should be the claimant. You know, I think that's pretty clear. Strikes me as the fairest and the most efficient way to make sure that the register is a more accurate reflection and a more enriched register as well. I think the answer is definitely the claimant. You know?
Great, thanks, Mick. And as we touched on with things like company number, being able to use that data for accurate business decisions.
And I thought I'd got away with it.
Yeah, that's the big finish, Eric. How do we ensure reforms improve inclusion rather than create new barriers? That's a tough one to answer quickly, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
That's a whole new event.
That's the next episode. In seriousness, it's about cooperation. It's about collaboration. There's a lot of willingness. The financial inclusion strategy is a good start point. There are other initiatives across financial services. I'm sure there will be in utilities and other sectors as well. So for me, in a word, collaboration.
Thanks, Eric. And thank you all. I know we've put you on the spot a little bit, some of those questions this afternoon. And just a final reminder for our audience, please do let us know if you've got any comments or questions about today's event. So that is it. Our report, today's event, our stats that we're publishing tomorrow aren't the end of the story. This is the continuation of a conversation, and so we're really keen to engage with our key stakeholders. As I mentioned earlier, and for many people listening in, we've got a really broad stakeholder base, and we're keen to hear from you as we work through 2026 to ensure that Registry Trust continues to think about and make changes that are going to improve the quality of the data that we maintain and the decisions that it supports. For now, I just want to thank our panel, who I think have been terrific. I'm sure you'll agree. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us this lunchtime. We hope you've enjoyed the first of hopefully what will be more events to come. And thank you for your time, and we will see you soon.